Welcome to Terror in Tandem, a podcast about finding entertainment in the macabre, hosted by the knowledgeable and lovable Laura and Richard Mathiasen. Each episode, we discuss the horror genre, from books to film to TV and beyond. Sometimes even from the beyond. You can find us online at terrorintandem.com and on Instagram at terrorintandem.
Well, that was a hilarious intro.
Was it?
No, it was a horrible. Nope, horrifyingly hilarious.
Yeah, that was like a mix of a bad Peter Lorre and a bad Vincent Price.
No, it was fine. I was trying to wrap it into the subject material of the day.
Right. Which is what?
Comedy horror. Oh, horror of comedies.
Horror comedies or comedy horror? Chicken,
the same
egg?
Thing.
I mean, which murdered first, the chicken or the egg?
So, yeah, I think the comedy horror subgenre of horror is what we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's definitely experiencing, like all things horror, a revival, but like all things horror, it is not new.
I don't know if I would call it a revival as much as a metamorphosis.
Sure. I mean, there's definitely a different kind of humor these days than what you would have seen in movies 20 years ago. But I think there's just a greater output of horror films these days.
Right.
And, we're seeing a lot of horror comedies, or at the very least, meta textual comedies that are like satirical or
right.
Try to be.
Yeah. Or like that dark comedies that border on the violent.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a horror show, but that was a common complaint of the writing staff of Veep was, how do we write satire about a U.S. government that has itself become a parody of government? So like, how do you write horror in an age when things are kind of tough?
Well, they didn't imagine that they'd be writing a how-to manual.
Yeah, that's the other part. But, horror and comedy, I think it was Robert Bloch, the author behind Psycho, who said that humor and terror are opposite sides of the same coin.
Yes.
And, think about it. Like, how many times have you been frightened, especially when you're startled, when it's like a jump scare type thing, and you follow it immediately with this like laughter, and it's they call it a nervous laughter, but it's a sense of relief that like, oh gosh, I'm not really actually in danger. And then you can you feel that relief, and then you also maybe feel a little silly that you physically reacted to something that wasn't actually threatening you.
Well, who says that those two masks, the tragedy and comedy, tragedy can be horror?
Absolutely.
That face of tragedy, the masks.
Oh yeah, that's
be a fear.
That's the face of somebody who's having a day.
Yeah. So when those two mix, it's can be quite amazing.
Absolutely.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the history of how comedy horror came to be?
Let's do it.
I'm ready. Yeah,
I mean, like all things cinema, it has its origins on the stage. So, back in olden times, we've discussed forms of mummery and things in the past in other episodes. Traveling troubadours, they would dress up in costumes and, depicting fey creatures or demons or devils. And like most performers, they responded to what the audience responded to. So the audience responded to ribald subjects, and they liked a good laugh. So it often turned into like demons kicking each other in the butt and that kind of thing. And that sort of mixture of the terrors of the night, which were very real to the medieval peasant, but making it goofy because it's just your neighbor dressed up in a funny outfit getting kicked in the tuchus.
So the term comedy horror really dates back as early as 1920.
Mm.
And from what you said, yes, it was used in stage plays and performances. Writers wanted to be more creative and tried to add new aspects to their work. So, although some of the plays were originally based on the genre of comedy, they decided to add humor into their work by creating haunted houses and monster stories, such as The Bat, the Cat, the Canary, and the Gorilla.
Mm.
And then in the 1930s and 40s, the horror comedy genre was popularized among small film platforms.
Yeah. The
but
Three
horror
Stooges did some. Laurel and Hardy did a couple of shorts.
Yep.
I remember seeing those as a kid.
Yeah. Live Ghost. That was a comedy horror film produced by Laurel and Hardy. It was a short in 1934. And then the Laurel and Hardy murder case in 1930. And Hunting We Will Go in 1942.
Those are two guys you want on the case for sure.
And then Abbott and Costello, Jerry Lewis and Bob Hope also started to make their foray. They did a show on Broadway called Zombies on Broadway. And that became the first popular horror comedy on Broadway for audiences.
I mean, this all really stemmed from just keeping an eye on what the people were into. Like all innovation, really, it doesn't happen in a boardroom. It happens organically out in the field. You know, these are performers who over time start to notice that their audiences are reacting to certain things, and they tailor their performances out of, you know, financial necessity. They want butts and seats.
Yep.
And there was historically there was a great shift on the stage after World War I, because that level of warfare affected people psychologically, you know, in the billions, to the point where, you know, it really signified the waning days of the Grand Guignol Theater in Paris. And it saw an infusion of humor into horror to really balance that out. And that's why some of the early horror comedies, they're so silly. They're really...
They are.
They're horror, like, barely.
Well, they're mainly up until the 60s, and also in the 60s, like with the Munsters and Addams Family and things like that. Mm-hmm. It was really more of, you know, parody and, like, comedy of
very
manners.
Safe. Very safe. Yeah. It was like Munsters and Addams Family were just essentially fish out of water comedies.
Yes.
Situational comedies. With
the horror element of them being, you know, monsters or vampires.
Yeah. But like totally harmless.
So in 1959, A Bucket of Blood.
Yeah.
Which is called like 1 part comedy, 3 parts horror. It came out in 1959.
Was that a Roger Corman?
Roger Corman.
Oh, the master.
He had already had 22 features
that week.
4 years of professional directing.
No, I think he just that week alone directed 22 movies.
He's noted to have neither eaten nor slept very often.
Huh.
Typically cranking out 5 films a year.
I mean, he launched the careers
and it definitely
everyone.
ate up his creative reserves.
He launched the careers of Steven Spielberg, James Cameron, Francis Ford Coppola, Jack Nicholson,
and A Bucket of Blood.
Yeah, and buckets of blood.
Also, you know, later in the 70s, we have The Cars That Ate Paris.
Oh, that's a good one.
Peter Weir.
Real weird movie.
It's an Aussie cult favorite.
Yeah, and Peter Weir is that's the director of Gallipoli. That's a very well respected, prolific, long term director.
Well, George Miller of Mad Max Fury Road fame took the spiky war machine design for the from The Cars That Ate Paris.
That came from an actual time period of Australian film output that was known as Ozploitation. And we should do an episode on that.
Like Australian?
Like OZ, like Aussie.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Ozploitation. Like blaxploitation in the United States was occurring around the same time. 70s, it was the era of exploitation, but we should revisit that at a point because Australia was making some really wild stuff at that time.
Well, in 1975, the Rocky Horror Picture Show came out, and it's been a cult classic for decades and decades. It really spoke to the youth culture. It was basically about self-awareness, and it was a campy horror comedy musical. And again, it has a lot of people
Tim
found
Curry
themselves this way. Yes.
is a goddamn legend.
But a lot of people watching that film, even to this day, there's
a
lot of risque
it's
sexual.
It's a very queer film.
Yeah.
For one thing, and I want to get into that a little bit later. I want to jump back a little bit to focus on a film you briefly mentioned, and that's 1948's Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
Yeah.
The reason I bring that up, it's not the first horror comedy, but it is widely recognized as the first financially successful horror comedy. And this movie was a big, big hit. Now,
it was very successful.
Nowadays, the idea of crossovers in franchises, it's not unfamiliar to us, but it's a little bit different. We are familiar with franchises that cross over within their own universe. So like Marvel characters can be in other Marvel movies, but they're not going to show up in a Star Wars movie. That would make sense. Back in the day, though, it was really about mixing different franchises that had no connective tissue that were just popular because the guys in the back room smoking cigars went, they like Abbott and Costello and they like Frankenstein, so let's fucking put them together. Make money. But in this case, it actually really worked. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Now, I'm going to level with you. I love Abbott and Costello. Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, I used to watch those shorts when I was a kid. I'm a big fan. This marries my, two of my loves. And it is definitely funnier than it is scary, but you really, when you're watching it, you really get why it was such a hit. Mm-hmm. It is a blast. Start to finish, it is fun. You can tell everyone's having a great time, and it's starring, some Lon Chaney Jr. and a real cast of Universal established characters. But imagine these days you're in the middle of a Star Wars movie and The Rock and Kevin Hart show up not as Star Wars characters, but as themselves or from another movie.
Shouldn't it been called Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein's Monster, though?
Listen, this movie, they actually meet everybody. Dracula's in it, the Wolfman's in it, and they went on to do sequels.
But they don't meet Dr. Frankenstein. They meet Frankenstein's monster.
Yes, that's of course. But I've heard the argument that say if the monster is the child of Victor Frankenstein, then why doesn't he share the surname Frankenstein? So he is Frankenstein Jr.
Oh, so now you've given up the...
I'm not giving up. It's an argument someone made recently, and I had not considered it that way. My last name is the same as my father's last name.
But to be a Frankenstein, is it to be the monster? Is it to be the doctor?
And, Victor did immediately reject his creation, his son.
Yeah. So I don't know.
Are names given or are they taken?
Frankenstein's monster and say that Abbott and Costello meets Frankenstein was a missed opportunity to clarify.
Yeah,
but Universal Monsters...
I'm sure that kept them all up at night when they were falling asleep on beds of money and cocaine.
I'm sure they're turning over in their graves.
Yeah.
I did want to point out that the 1930s and 40s, it was really about introducing horror into comedy.
Yeah. And
So
the
it
comedy
wasn't really about comedy horror, like horror comedies. It was about taking horror elements and mixing them into comedic performances.
and the two things were happening at this time. This was still early film days, so a lot of the quote unquote comedy was, it was coming from a vaudevillian background, which meant it was really situational and slapstick and exaggerated. So you've got like the Three Stooges beating the shit out of each other. You've got Lou Costello doing his like terrified, can't speak routine. So the other thing is, this is before the Catholic Commission really, really got its hooks into Hollywood, so they could get away with certain things. By modern standards, they're still quite tame, but they weren't as anodyne as they became. Like the Munsters and the Addams Family were really, really, heavily censored.
Well, as we progress into the 60s, that's where we started to see original horror, like novels, TV shows, and movies. We had mentioned the Munsters and Addams Family, but I also wanted to say that it gave birth, the 60s and horror comedy gave birth to the cartoon Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
Which has been a success for decades.
Ever since. Yeah.
And as I said, like a youth or younger generation of like finding themselves and emerging came out in the 70s with Rocky Horror Picture Show. So if you see a progression in society as a reflection in the medium that we're talking about, it was also reflective of that. In the 80s, we started to see a lot of horror comedy.
Yes.
This is where it really, really exploded.
Gets a little messy at times.
Yeah, I would argue that at its best, we saw some horror comedies at their best in the 80s.
I would agree with that, especially in terms of comedy that fall under the eat the rich genre. There are some real special ones.
So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll run through the rest of the decade's worth of horror comedies and then talk about some of our favorites.
Yeah, that sounds great. And also, I want to talk a little bit about camp.
Yeah.
Nothing beats a warm bowl of soup for those days when you're not quite feeling yourself, am I right? Well, the demons wearing your body like a rotting meat suit may be legion, but there's only one thing they're craving on an excellent day for an exorcism. Why not treat yourself, and everyone inside you, to Reagan's Home-Style Pea Soup? Every serving of Reagan's Home-Style Pea Soup contains all the nutrients both your body and the archlords of hell inhabiting it need to survive another night chained to your bed. Holy water burning your skin? Well, not only is every bowl of Reagan's Home-Style Pea Soup delicious and filling, but it's also a salve for divine burns on your corrupted flesh. Rub a little pea soup on it, my dad used to say. And my dad was the devil, so he would know. Reagan's Home-Style Pea Soup is designed to be absorbed quickly, so don't worry about artillery barfing all over those mean old priests. Your hideous human flesh will still feel satisfied, no matter how much of it ends up on your mom and that priest you might have, but definitely did just kill with your mind. Reagan's Home-Style Pea Soup. Just like your mother used to make before she sucked in hell. This is a fake ad for a fake product on a horror-themed podcast. We do not condone nor endorse becoming possessed by demons and murdering exorcists, no matter what your mother does in hell.
And we're back.
Are we?
We never left.
Yeah, where are we? When are we?
So just back to the 80s, I want to just run through some of the films that came out during this decade.
Gag me with a spoon.
Teen Wolf, 1985. An American Werewolf in London, which I'll talk about later.
Okay, hold on. Just quick. I don't know if you've seen the. So there, that there's the new Teen Wolf show on MTV,
yes.
And they're making a movie, and it's called Teen Wolf the Movie, and all I can think is, oh wow, you finally made a movie out of it. based on a TV show that was based on 2 movies. So it's like, Teen Wolf, we finally made a movie.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I guess they can't call it Teen Wolf.
It's just more Jason Bateman erasure. Teen Wolf 2.
I'm sure he'd like to erase that.
I would.
So yeah, Teen Wolf. An American Werewolf in London, 1981.
Oh, my.
Fright Night, which we've talked about in our
Fright
vampire
Night.
episode. Mr. Vampire. Once Bitten. So there's a lot of vampire themes.
Once Bitten, I think was either
1985.
Was it the film debut of Jim Carrey? It was one of his first.
Maybe
It was one of his earliest
definitely
movies.
one of his earlier. Vamp.
Oh man, I remember that one.
Love at First Bite.
Mm-hmm. With my hero.
Yep. So lots of vampires, monsters, and werewolves there.
Mm-hmm.
And then an increase in like the gory element with Basket Case, Dead Alive.
Yeah, you've got the trauma films like,
but those are coming out in like more of the 90s.
Well, you've got like Toxic Avenger,
Yep.
Class of Nukem High, coming from Lloyd Kaufman and Trauma.
One of the things I did want to mention though in the 80s is Little Shop of Horrors.
Hell yeah.
So it is, Frank Oz.
Directed
Originally,
it. Yep.
yeah.
It's actually
adapted from Broadway.
It began its life as a Roger Corman film.
Yep. Based on a 1960 film from Roger Corman.
Then it became a Broadway musical
by Frank Oz.
Mm-hmm.
And then he created the 1986 version film Little Shop of Horrors. So
just a quick,
what do you just say about Teen Wolf?
I know
this and that.
Everything,
basically, this is exactly the same.
We're in a Battlestar Galactica situation. Everything has happened before, and everything will happen again. But just a quick aside for Frank Oz. Wow, Miss Piggy and Yoda, and like a legit film director. That guy has had such an amazing contribution to my childhood and life, and frankly, my adulthood.
And so he had to blend the comedy and horror, but also music.
Yeah.
Again, the musical aspect of it.
Yeah. Oh, and Levi Stubbs doing the voice of Audrey too, the killer plant, which is why it has such a beautiful, beautiful voice.
Yeah, very deep.
Yeah,
a very
sonorous,
deep voice.
Lovely voice. Yeah,
Absolutely.
One of the greatest of all time. Levi Stubbs, break your heart. Oh.
Anything else you want to
let's
to
talk,
the 80s?
Yeah. Obviously Ghostbusters.
Yes.
And
Gremlins.
Ghostbusters, I would argue.
And Haunted Honeymoon.
Is the greatest.
And Critters.
Yeah, Critters for
sure. So we had all these like critter, goblin, ghoul types.
But Ghostbusters sits at the top of the pops. It is the king for a reason. It's just one of the funniest movies I think ever made. But it's also the greatest horror comedy ever made, in my opinion. Funnily enough, before his death, John Belushi was cast as Peter Venkman. And I sometimes think it's interesting to imagine a universe in which John Belushi was Venkman. Bill Murray is so iconic in that role, and it's hard to picture anyone else.
I can't imagine it being worse.
Who knows?
It would be different.
It would be different for sure.
Funny still.
Absolutely. But, it's somewhere out there in the multiverse. There's an alternate Earth where Ghostbusters starred John Belushi instead of Bill Murray, who I guess is doing Meatballs 3.
So as we see the, emergence in the 80s of like critters and goblins and vampires,
but also like major commercial viability. These movies are hitting the top 10s. They're winning awards. They're making bank.
They're taking all of the classic like ghouls and goblins and monsters and making them marketable.
This is also a time when it's actually comedies are really hurting right now in terms of their place in the box office, but this is a time when they were reigning supreme. So marrying two very successful genres together that at the same time were experiencing big budget explosions. On the horror side, you've got Nightmare on Elm Street making blockbuster amounts of money. On the comedy side, you've got the rise of Eddie Murphy and these hybrids with action movies like 48 Hours and Lethal Weapon that are making tremendous amounts of money. So you're absolutely right. From a studio point of view, it's kind of a golden age.
And then as we get through the 90s, we start to see like a fear-based, like a phobia-based comedy horror.
Oh, yeah.
Tremors, Arachnophobia, Lake Placid, Eight-Legged Freaks. That's a little in the 2000s, early aughts. But that starts to like really get into, you know, your common fears or things that you have phobias about.
Yeah.
And really capitalize on that.
Yeah, the horror starts to become a little bit more personal at that point, and a bit uncomfortable, which actually fits the way comedy was trending, because we're starting to enter the era of awkward, uncomfortable comedy being popularized. You know, the British influence is making its way across the pond, and we're getting that more, you know, finding amusement in uncomfortable situations. So the horror elements are becoming squirmier.
So we see also in 1992 Army of Darkness.
Yes.
So, you know, it's like the Sam Raimi Evil Dead franchise, obviously.
Yeah.
Is like the now that has elevated the horror comedy genre.
Unfortunately for everybody, it bombed at the box office, but it was the moment in the Evil Dead franchise when it became like just straight up comedy.
Yeah.
Evil Dead 2 was a horror comedy for sure, but Evil Dead 3 was like it was a straight comedy. Yeah.
So as we keep going, we start to see horror spoofs.
Yeah, well, you know, any genre that sticks around long enough eventually becomes a parody of itself.
And also like a parody within itself.
Yeah. You're able to deconstruct it.
Scary Movie.
Mm-hmm.
American Psycho.
Well, you know, Scary Movie's interesting because it's a parody of a metatextual satire.
Yeah.
You know, it's like we're really getting into the Ouroboros there.
I read on one, like,
it's also a piece of shit.
Reviewers that's 1 part comedy, 1 part horror, 4 parts dumpster fluid.
Yeah, I saw it in the theater because I was in high school and all my friends wanted to see it, and it was around the time someone was being pinned to a ceiling by like mountains of ejaculate that I was like, this isn't for me.
But American Psycho, on the other hand,
yes, that is more my jam.
Is more horror. So you can see that if it's like a half comedy, half horror, or it's real horror and part comedy, American Psycho was a really good representation of this, because Christian Bale, first of all, was super charismatic.
Spot on. Perfect.
It's based on a novel by Chuck Palahniuk, right?
No, Bret Easton Ellis.
Oh, Brad Easton Ellis.
Brett.
And has an amazing soundtrack. I feel like this was one of those movies where soundtracks really played a very big role.
I mean, it's expertly directed by Mary Harron. She fought tooth and nail to have Christian Bale in the role. It was supposed to be Leonardo DiCaprio, who, you know, no offense, he's a tremendous actor, but Christian Bale needed to play this role.
Yeah.
It in a tremendous career, it is the role of a lifetime for him.
The only other one that I can think would be Matthew McConaughey, just knowing what he's done since then.
But it's a great litmus test, American Psycho, for if you watch that and you don't understand that it's a satire or a comedy, you have missed the entire point of all of it. And they basically spell it out at the end when he's like, you know, hallucinating. But yeah,
it's still very dark.
As someone who grew up in New York, unfortunately surrounded by those kinds of people, I love that movie so much because it's a skewering of a very particular kind of bastard.
Yeah. I mean, and it definitely has that slasher.
Oh my God, it's violent as hell. He's got an axe, a nail gun.
So horror comedies reflected the slasher,
it's got Phil
the
Collins.
reemergence of the slasher genre in the early aughts as well.
I think you start to see more of a balancing between horror and comedy.
Yes.
They're definitely more comfortable introducing. At this point, there's enough audience observation that studios are realizing we can actually make a movie that is on its own horrific and scary, and people will still see it for the comedic elements in there. Like you can have a movie that is violent and legitimately scary, like American Psycho, but also hilariously funny.
Yeah.
It may not be the same kind of scary movie type humor, and I don't mean that to sound as like snobby as it's coming across. I just mean there's a big difference between very broad and obvious physical humor and the sort of cutting satire of American Psycho, where it's maybe not funny, haha, but it's a satire. It's certainly acerbic.
Yeah. So as we sort of bring it up to present day, we're seeing, late 2000s, within the 2000s and like mid and late 2000s, we're starting to see the zombie.
Oh God. I mean,
the zombie
absolutely.
monster of
Everywhere.
horror comedy. Yep, everywhere. So like character focused zombie films like Shaun of the Dead,
mm-hmm.
Jennifer's Body, and Zombieland.
Mm-hmm.
And then
and Slither coming a little later. That was like mind control worms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then not so character driven like Fido, zombie strippers.
Dead Snow is a great one from Sweden. It's
Yep.
a hilarious Nazi zombie movie. Really, really good.
So I want to specifically talk about Shaun of the Dead, Edgar Wright. He has never really done the same film twice.
True. True.
He did the buddy cop, a spaghetti western, and then this post-apocalyptic horror comedy.
And had his start on one of my very favorite TV shows of all time, Spaced.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really did have at the core their friendship between the characters.
Oh, Nick Frost and Simon Pegg.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a wonderful, heartwarming relationship.
And then with Zombieland, it's didn't really have mainstream success. Since it has, but at the beginning, it didn't have mainstream success.
I think people didn't know what to make of it.
Because it alienated people who wanted a dark horror comedy.
It's a very silly movie.
Yes.
It's also hyper stylized. Ruben Fleischer is a very stylistic director.
It didn't know really what lane to fit in. And so the audience that would typically go to see a zombie horror comedy.
But like a lot of movies like that.
Now it has a cult following.
Oh, yeah. It really does. It's okay.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
It's not on my tops, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So do you want to break down a little bit of the horror comedy genre? Because we have mentioned a few terms, and I just wanted to give a little bit of an explanation on horror comedy genre.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about camp.
I'll go through that, and you can sort of expand on them.
Oh, okay. Well, what did you want me to hit up?
Well, I'll point to you when it's time for you to talk.
That's really helpful, actually. Can you do that in all aspects of life?
Yes.
Oh, my
See,
God.
everybody, you heard it here. It's not me telling him to do it. It's him wanting me to tell him to do it.
Listen, I am a lazy beta. I just point me in direction, tell me what to do, and I want to clock out and go home.
So in the majority of horror comedy, there's gallows humor. And for those of you that don't know, gallows humor is funny in the face or response to a hopeless situation or hopelessness.
Basically every joke you've told for the last 6 years has probably been gallows
I thought
humor.
You just meant me.
No, anyone alive and conscious since 2015, it's you're stuck in a crummy situation. You can't get out of it, so you might as well crack a joke.
If you think about only horror films, like just horror, they're meant to scare. But if you add comedy horror, then it's the permission to laugh at your fear or at the relief of the fear leaving.
It also takes a bit of the moral weight off of the audience. It's kind of telling the audience, like, it's okay that you're having a good time watching people get killed on screen. It's okay. You can laugh about it. It's fake. It does remind the audience, like, look, this is a ride we're on. We're having fun.
So maybe I'll tell you the different comedy types of comedy genres in the industry, And as you add the horror element to it, why don't you give us an example of what these films are, or TV shows, or what have you? So, Comedy of Manners, which is a satire on the lifestyle of social class.
Oh God! In that instance, we got to go to the '80s with Society. Brian Yuzna's Society, probably the greatest takedown of the upper class sort of NIMBY white suburban. It's very juicy, very, very funny.
I would say Funny Games.
Funny Games, Michael Haneke. Yeah. I would go with the original, although the remake is pretty good too. He directed his own remake, remade his own film. Yeah.
Next up is dark comedy, which is, taboo subjects like murder or war.
Yeah.
But
that has a very, very old tradition. What did you say?
Dark comedy.
Yeah, but what was I feel like I spoke over your example.
Did.
I'm sorry.
It's taboo subject like murder or war.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So it's based in that, but then there's like a comedic element that lifts it.
Death Becomes Her is a good example of that because, these women are like the lengths that they go to maintain their beauty, and it doesn't even work anyway. And has a particularly dark ending that is played for laughs, but when you think about it for longer than 5 seconds, is actually cosmically horrifying in like a deeply disturbing way.
Fish Out of Water, which you mentioned earlier. It's when the main character finds himself in a strange environment, such as gender swapping.
What, like just one of the guys?
No, we're talking about horror.
Yeah, I know. I just
like Crocodile Dundee.
So
is a fish out of water.
There was actually a movie that just came out in 2022 that was really great. Deadstream. It was like a disgraced live streamer goes into a haunted house and basically gets into a lot more than he bargained for. Sometimes that can actually be played for straight horror, where you have like ghost hunters who. There was a really great Korean film a few years ago called Gunjam Haunted Asylum, where it's like a ghost hunting team went in, but the place was really haunted, and it just really fucked them up. Yeah.
Next up is gross out films.
Ooh, yeah, there are those.
Yeah, like focus on toilet humor and often aimed at younger audiences.
Yeah, like Critters, for sure. I mean, it doesn't happen in the movie, which was a real bummer, but on the poster that it's coming out of a toilet.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I waited the whole movie for one to come out of a toilet, and it doesn't.
Parodies and spoofs, which we have already talked
Scary
about.
Movie and
romantic comedy.
Oh,
we just watched
Warm Bodies is one with Nicholas Hoult.
We just watched one. Anna
and the Apocalypse.
Yeah,
there was a bit of that. Yeah. Oh, that was. Gosh, that movie was sadder than I anticipated. I did, of course, obviously.
And then screwball comedy, which I would say like Ghostbusters would be one.
For sure. Yeah, a little bit of slapstick. The Frighteners, by Peter Jackson is definitely in there. Just a really fun time. So before we get into some personal recommendations and favorites, let's talk a little bit about camp in horror, because it is... from its earliest days.
Camp Crystal Lake.
That's not what I mean.
Oh.
Although that could be its own thing, just campground horror. So camp is a little bit, it's a particular kind of humor. And it is, I guess a good way to describe it might be, it's deliberately cheesy. When you're being campy, you are telling a dad joke, telling a joke that is like a little cringeworthy, but the humor is... you're doing it on purpose. You're fully aware that you're doing it, and you're playing it that way. So you mentioned Rocky Horror Picture Show is one of the greatest examples of camp, but camp has its origins in, the earliest horror shorts, like the Three Stooges. It's campy comedy. It's all, very broad, very in your face, very obvious,
right?
Because it was originally designed for the stage. And they hadn't figured out how to make things smaller for the screen yet. Now, the interesting thing about camp is, especially in the 60s and 70s, it really became intertwined and became a large part of the queer community, and especially the drag community. And it's being celebrated nowadays in ways that are right out in the open and just fabulous. And, you know, I love when you see like these quote unquote tough guys watching RuPaul's Drag Race and having a great time.
Yeah,
that's like my favorite. It's
a great show.
That's like my favorite genre of TikTok video, is like, you know, grizzled dad watching RuPaul and getting into it. But, you know, there's the Boulet brothers doing Dragula on Shudder. And you know, there's the queer tradition of camp, of wild, bombastic expression. And it plays so well into certain forms of horror, because when you drill down to it, a lot of horror tales, if you play it a certain way, they're ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
They're very silly.
Absolutely.
They're, you know, supernatural and crazy. So you can play it like an Ari Aster film where it's scary as hell and disturbing, or you can go campy with it. And
what's interesting about what you said is very silly. So if you think about Stranger Things and Vecna, and there's a picture like behind the scenes picture of Vecna in his whole outfit with Sadie Sink, and they're just like cracking up and like just casual.
Yeah, it's like watching.
It's like ridiculous when you pull it apart like that.
It's like watching.
But it was really scary.
Behind the scenes photos of the Planet of the Apes movies, where like, you know, Roddy McDowall is smoking a cigarette with wearing the mask and everything and dressed like an ape.
Right.
Yeah. If you pull the frame out like by a foot, you see all of the stuff behind it. But camp it's just like a safe way to cut the tension and remind everybody that we're in this for a good time.
Yeah.
Sure, some guy just got stabbed and this is a murder movie, but it's all fun.
Right.
It's all fun and games. And the camp is a very tricky thing to do, because when done right, it's over the top and it's outrageous, but
that's why
actually
I love Clue
executing
so much.
it. Oh, Clue is a great example
because
of that.
it's, if you look at that movie and you're trying to critique, oh well, this is just like they're being overly dramatic.
Yeah, you've missed the point.
Yeah, it is meant to do that.
Exactly. It's supposed to be that way.
They're being blown out versions of these characters.
Yeah, like another
that
recent
would be invited to.
Another recent horror musical was Repo the Genetic Opera.
Yeah, right.
You know, but the use of camp, it when it's done well, it looks outrageous and big, but it's actually, the application of it is very tricky to do, because it's so easy to make it stupid,
right,
or cringeworthy, or just flat out, it just falls flat, you know, with a thud. So true camp really is an art form when done well, but it's so intertwined both with the queer community and with the horror community. And lately, you're starting to see both of those things, not that they haven't been intertwined in the past, but you're just seeing them being mainstreamed in a way that's, again, producing more talent, more stories, more points of view.
Mainline it right into my ear and eye holes, people.
But the tradition of camp and horror and especially queer creators, it's just a wonderful trifecta.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Well, just before we talk about our recommendations / favorites, I just wanted to say that the comedy of manners, so like a horror comedy of manners, The Menu.
Yeah, which we just watched.
Yeah, which would be a late. Oh, yeah. It really does take apart society's obsession with
image and
not
status.
Just image, status, but like
letting everyone else know, like,
but what you should like,
yeah,
but not knowing why you like it.
Yeah, yeah.
There was one part of the film that the chef asks a customer who frequents the restaurant, "What did you eat the last time you were here?"
Yeah.
And he couldn't name one thing.
Yeah.
And he said, "Any time that you were here." And so that's it.
So one of the writers on that film writes for The Onion. And
yes.
Another writer, it writes for Succession.
This was their first feature.
But it's it's such a razor sharp, spot on takedown of very particular types of really, really exhausting people. And when you look at the writing backgrounds of the screenwriters, you're like, oh, wow, these dudes are experts.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. The Menu is fantastic, everybody. It just hit HBO Max. Totally watch it. It's a really good time, and it's another one of those perfect for the moment.
Yeah, you
movies.
really have to find the humor in it.
It's very funny.
And very dark.
Quite dark, but it's also a very right now kind of movie.
Yeah, it's a real good. There's not too much comedy in it to take away from how dark and how serious you should take.
The comedy is acerbic and
what
biting.
Subject?
It's more like, you're not going to be holding your sides and laughing out loud, but it is very funny.
No, you're uncomfortably laughing because you know what.
Because you've met all these
referring
assholes
to.
before. Yeah. And maybe you have behaved in certain ways before. Yeah.
So how many favorites do you have? And I'm guessing they're all movies, right?
I do. I have 3 movies that I would like to recommend that are 3 movies that maybe those of you out there haven't seen. And I have 1 book that I will quickly mention.
I'm a simp, and I'm just going to go with my recommendations that maybe you've heard of and probably have seen, but I'm going to recommend them anyway because they're my top.
That just covers all of our bases, and you are not a simp at all.
You just want to crack up, don't you? Because I called myself a simp.
I barely even know what it means. I'm so old.
Why don't you start with yours?
So I'm going to start out with a film from 1992 that you actually briefly mentioned. It is Peter Jackson's Brain Dead, also known as Dead Alive. So this was Peter Jackson's, I believe...
Peter Jackson from Lord of the Rings.
From Lord of the
fame,
Rings.
Everyone.
Oh, yeah. We all know Peter Jackson now.
He got a start in ridiculous horror.
Now, at this time, he had only made 1 film, which was Bad Taste. And the film he made after this was Meet the Feebles, which was Puppets. So this was his biggest budget. And I was a huge Peter Jackson fan at the time. He went on to do Heavenly Creatures and The Frighteners. But with his output at the time, I remember when they announced him as taking on like $1 billion franchise with Lord of the Rings, I was like, wait, Peter Jackson? The guy, Brain Dead Peter Jackson? That's insane and brilliant. So anyway, Brain Dead is, just real quick, it's a low-budget New Zealand horror comedy about a lonely, awkward young man named Lionel who lives with his horrible, overbearing mother, Vera, who gets bitten by a weird spider monkey monster thing that was illegally imported from an island. It turns her into like a rotting zombie monster. Lionel falls in love with a local woman who is her name is Paquita, and she is Spanish Romani. So she is just a lovely young lady. She's also very shy and quiet like Lionel, and obviously Lionel's mother hates her because she's a racist old bitch. But the movie is so over the top. I mean, once the zombie stuff happens, it's so gory, it's so violent, it's hilariously funny, it's campy as hell. I mean, there's a priest that fights zombies with kung fu. There is, until the 2013 remake of Evil Dead, this was the record holder for most blood used on a film set. Fake blood. The scene where he is going through a crowd full of zombies with a lawnmower is the scene in question.
Yikes.
Yeah, just gallons and like unbelievable amounts of goop and blood. But it's one of those movies that it's so violent that it kind of stops being gory and just becomes ridiculous. The humor really hits. It's also very sweet. Mm-hmm. It's got just enough of heart and pathos in it. You really root for the characters because they're so unassuming, and they're such underdogs. You just honestly want them to be happy, really. Yeah. But the movie is an absolute blast, and it's got great special effects. You can see the seeds that would later become Weta, his special effects company that does all the good shit. So Brain Dead, Dead Alive, whatever it's called, 1992, it's an all-timer.
So my first is An American Werewolf in London.
Hell yeah.
I'm going in chronological order.
Same.
This is from 1981.
Oh my gosh.
And it stars David Naughton. And for those of you who don't know David Naughton, you should definitely look him up. Look up his IMDb. He was actually the long-time running Be a Pepper from the Dr. Pepper commercial.
Really?
And you can be a pepper too. Yep.
Oh my God.
But some of his movies that make me like that I know
I love IMDb.
is Midnight Madness, which listen,
Yeah.
I and maybe 2 other people in the world love that movie so much. But he was like I would say for decades, he's been in a lot of films.
Yeah.
He was in Sybil, She's Having a Baby.
He's very much a character actor.
Yes.
This is the role he is probably most well known for.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Griffin Dunn,
Yeah.
who
I mean, Griffin Dunn's been in everything.
I mean, you should definitely know him. He most recently, I would say most people right now in the zeitgeist would probably know him for This Is Us.
Yeah.
He did play the grown-up version
Another
of Nikki.
hilarious comedy.
But he's been in hundreds of movies.
So much stuff. And he's actually really funny.
He's
in American
great.
Werewolf. He provides most of the comedic relief in this movie.
Yeah, it's a ridiculous movie. So basically, David, played by David Naughton, and Jack, played by Griffin Dunn, are American college students backpacking through Britain, and then a wolf attacks them. David survives.
Don't go out to the moors.
David survives, but Jack is killed.
And there's a wonderful scene preceding that where they stop at an old pub, like a stone ancient pub, and everybody looks at them, and there's like a grizzled old man who's like, don't go out at night.
Yeah.
You know, it's like classic shit.
Don't do it.
Yeah.
Right.
And of course they do it.
I think David Schofield is in that scene, actually. And so anyway, David survives and he heals in the hospital. He has like terrible nightmares of his friend Jack, who warns David that he's becoming a werewolf. And then,
he sees Jack, but he sees him like all eviscerated and fucked up.
Yeah. And then basically he thinks about killing himself before the next full moon comes, but he doesn't. And then he turns into this like crazy beast. And I have to say, listen, if you go back and watch this,
yes,
obviously technology has caught up with filmmaking
and
blah, blah, blah. But the transformation
yes,
of 1981,
it still stands.
It is incredible. It is so good. And I really believe that a lot of the werewolf transformation shows and movies since have taken from John Landis, who is the director of this film, and also wrote the screenplay. They took this like broken bone growth imagery from this film.
Oh, I mean, Rick Baker did the effects. He's an all-time master of practical effects.
Yep.
But yeah, the werewolf transformation from this movie still stands all these decades later as one of the best ever filmed. And I'll say, having recently watched Werewolf by Night, the Marvel presentation.
Oh, right.
The scene heavily influenced by that scene as well.
Absolutely.
And what you just said, that whole trope of like bone cracking transformations, you see that all over the place.
Painful it is.
Oh, it's really works for me too. I love it.
I think that's a really interesting interpretation of a human becoming a monster.
Like your skin ripping and that it's painful and horrific. Yeah, I know.
And Frank Oz was also in American Werewolf.
Yeah.
And he plays Miss Piggy in it.
Wait, really?
Yes.
I haven't seen this movie in forever.
Maybe you should watch it.
I'm gonna have to. So my next one, I'm gonna go in chronological order as well. So for me, that would be 2002's Bubba Hotep, directed by Don Coscarelli of Phantasm fame. Now, Bubba Hotep is it's based on a novel, or a short story. I'm just gonna. I think Joe Lansdale wrote it. I'm just gonna go ahead and say, just watch the movie. The movie, in my opinion, is a bit better, honestly, and that does sometimes happen. So, first off, Bubba Hotep. Oh man, this movie is screamingly funny. It's a real cult classic. So it was written and directed by Coscarelli. The premise is Bruce Campbell plays Elvis Presley if Elvis Presley did not die. So he's in the early 2000s. He's in a nursing home. Nobody believes that he's Elvis Presley. He tells everyone he is, but no one believes him. They just think he's a crazy man. His best friend is John F. Kennedy, who is played by the late, great Ossie Davis. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with Ossie Davis, he was black. And very, very memorably in the movie, when he was asked about this, how can you be JFK? You're a black man. He said, the CIA dyed me this color. So, like, Ossie Davis is so good in this movie. He is hilariously funny. And he was an actor who usually played dramatic roles. So seeing him in this goofball horror movie was a real blast. Now, it's these two old fuddy-duddies farting around this nursing home where this evil, ancient Egyptian spirit is killing old people. And it's like the perfect feeding ground for this thing that steals life forces, because it's also a bit of a commentary on how we treat our elderly as disposable, and we kind of plop them somewhere and forget about them. So these murders go unnoticed for a very long time. And the only people who are sounding the alarm are, a guy who thinks he's Elvis and a guy who thinks he's JFK. Anyway, the movie has a lot of heart. It's so goddamn funny. It has maybe the greatest opening monologue of any movie I've ever heard. It is so funny. I mean, I remember the first time I watched it on DVD, I had to keep rewinding because I kept laughing over the monologue. It's very immature. Now, the cool thing about this movie is Don Coscarelli is such a maverick. He's such an old school guerrilla filmmaker that when he made this movie, he literally put a print of it in the trunk of his car and drove it around the country himself to film festivals, screening it, showing it at festivals, while Bruce Campbell was doing his thing, hyping it up, so that by the time it finally got released, it had already built up this massive cult following. Now, this movie was never going to be successful commercially. It's just not that kind of movie. But it was an instant cult classic and has remained so ever since. If you haven't seen Bubba Hotep, I cannot recommend it enough. It is such a gem. Such like a wonderful, incredible movie that it really deserves a lot more recognition than it gets. I promise a good time.
Awesome. The title alone should be intriguing.
Now, for many, many years, there was rumor they were going to be making a follow-up called Nosferatu. Bubba Nosferatu, and Ron Perlman was going to take over as Elvis, but that just never came together, unfortunately.
Okay, so my next is a book, and it's by a repeat author of mine, Stephen Graham Jones.
Yeah,
and it's called The Last Final Girl,
okay.
And it's from 2012, and this book is, like, the tagline is, life in a slasher film is easy. You just have to know when to die. So essentially it takes place in a suburban town in Texas, with like everybody's a common person, it's just a normal town. And you have this homecoming princess, Lindsay. She just escaped death at the hands of a brutal, sadistic murderer in a Michael Jackson mask. And up on the cliff in the town, she's rescued by a horse, and bravely defeated the killer. She's like alone and they braless. Like, it's really a campy version.
Yeah, I mean, this happens to me all the time.
And so her story is a legend in the town. She's like the heroic final girl, and she's like a virginal hero.
Okay.
Heroine. And so Billie Jean, the masked killer,
who, by the way, and I want to set the record straight, is not my lover.
Yeah. The killer is still out killing. And this victory for Lindsay, she doesn't just want to kill one killer or escape one killer. She wants to be the ultimate final girl. So what she does is her high school is filled with final girls. And she chooses to host all of the virgins and misfits and final girls, to replace all of the murdered members of like her homecoming court. And then it becomes a night of a fight for survival to become the ultimate final girl to escape.
Holy shit.
These,
so it's like a battle royale of final girls?
Exactly.
That is bonkers.
I know. So I just wanted to recommend that because Stephen Graham Jones is definitely one of my newer favorite authors.
Sounds like a real departure from his other work, which is fucking dark.
This is also dark.
No, but
it's a dark comedy.
Yeah.
It's I think they described it as a cross between like if Quentin Tarantino made Cabin in the Woods.
Okay. So like, can I ask? Do you think if Billie Jean had a partner in crime, would it be Dirty Diana?
I hope not.
Well, whoever it was, I'm sure it would be some sort of PYT. Anyway, my last one is another just joyful, hilarious romp.
Your last one, you said you had...
I had a book, but my last movie...
Oh, okay, good.
My last movie is 2010's Tucker and Dale versus Evil, directed by Eli Craig. I don't know why this movie hasn't gotten a sequel. This movie rules. It fucking rules so hard. It is just one of the best. When you think horror comedy, whenever anyone asks me, it is the first one I go to. I recommend it constantly. So Tucker and Dale versus Evil. It's about these two goofy hillbillies, played by Tyler Labine as Dale and Alan Tudyk is Tucker. Perfectly cast. Their chemistry is wonderful. And they're these two real stereotypical redneck types, but they're very sweet. They're kind of goofy. They're kind. They're not racist or mean or closed off or anything like that. They're just bumpkins, basically. Right. So they buy this shitty old cabin that they have dreams to turn into their hunting lodge. And it's this dirty, gross, scary place. And, they're fixing it up. And a group of college kids stumbles upon them. Now, in the background, in this town, there's an unsolved murder from years ago. There was a serial killer that killed a bunch of people and then disappeared. So there's always been in the background of this town this sort of story. Now, through a series of circumstances, one of the college students, played by Katrina Bowden, she was the intern on 30 Rock. Very, very pretty blonde actor.
Right. Okay. Yep.
She basically she gets knocked out. Dale takes her in, and the other college students, when they're looking, they see this creepy, dirty cabin with two hillbillies, and their friend is inside. Mm-hmm. Now, what's really happening is they're taking care of her, and they're genuinely concerned, and they're like, oh, what should we do? Well, the college kids think that, they're torturing her, and basically what ends up happening is these college kids start attacking Tucker and Dale and getting killed in the process because they're dumbasses. So they're running at them with with a knife or something, and they trip and fall and stab themselves. And Tucker and Dale's reactions are genuine horror of oh my God. And there's a moment in the movie where they call the cops and they're saying something like, you got to help us. There's a group of crazy college kids killing themselves in front of us and they won't stop. And the movie is so fucking funny. It's really violent. It subverts every trope there is. It not only subverts the tropes of slasher movies and Cabin in the Woods movies, but it also subverts the tropes of characterization. It does it a couple of ways. Tucker and Dale are uneducated rubes, but they are the absolute heroes of this film.
Unlikely heroes.
Their friendship is magnificent. They're loyal. They're kind. They're altruistic. They stick their neck out for strangers. Katrina Bowden, by all accounts, and in 30 Rock she played this kind of character. She's a ditzy, blonde, hot girl, co-ed. But in this movie, her character has agency. She's kind. She falls in love with Dale because even though he's Tyler Labine and he's, this chubby, goofy hillbilly, she sees his heart and his spirit and his kindness, and she actually falls for him. It's a movie where the dork gets the girl. Mm-hmm. It's a movie where the right qualities are celebrated. And it takes a few twists and turns. It has a really fun ending, but ultimately it's a really nice movie. And it's a weird thing to say because it is rather violent. But what I mean is it doesn't end on a downer.
Right.
And you can watch it with a clean conscience. It is also just so funny. It is so goddamn
really,
funny.
Really funny.
Yeah, Alan Tudyk is, as always, incredible. But Tyler Labine, he's been doing a lot of dramatic work over the years recently. I'd love to see him do another comedy because that's where he got his start. And I always thought he was so funny.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. Tucker and Dale versus Evil.
My next is a little bit of a cheat because it is a movie and a TV show. Different, but the same.
I love it.
So it is, I'll first talk about the movie because that's the origin of the TV show. And it's 2014's What We Do in the Shadows.
Oh, yay. As dear listener will know, a favorite.
Yes. So this is Viego, Deacon, and Vladislav.
Yes.
They're vampire roommates who struggle with anything roommates would struggle with, which is like, who's going to do chores and who's getting, paying the rent and how are you bringing in that money? And also like roommate conflicts, which is really funny. What's great about this is it's a mockumentary. So it's presented to you like it's a never before seen or accessed to a vampire documentary, but it's a mockumentary.
If you were to be told that, you would think you're about to watch the coolest thing ever.
Yeah.
And what you end up watching is the most banal, mundane, like kind of pathetic existence.
It's amazing.
It's great.
Yeah. So they have a new friend that comes in, like a newly turned vampire hipster that comes into their lives and moves in with them and really wants to like jazz up the lifestyle because these vampires are old.
Yeah, they're centuries
They're old.
Yeah,
so
and
it's
still,
like, what would you do? I mean, yeah.
You know, like your uncle that hasn't made a new reference past like 1987. Well, just picture that.
You've done all these
like
things.
500
You've gone
years.
out, and trashed places and you've stayed up all night and you've rocked out with the best bands in the world. But now you're like, yeah, I just... I'd rather just stay home and
like it's tomorrow
relax.
recycling day.
Yeah. So it stars Jermaine Clement, Taika Waititi, who is also the creators of the film and then adaptation. Johnny Bra, is that how you pronounce it?
I don't know.
He played Deacon.
But Rhys Darby's is in it as well. He was the head of the werewolves, not swearwolves.
In the movie?
Yeah, he was in Flight of the Conchords. He's a frequent collaborator.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah. Oh yeah.
He's in Our Flag Means Death. Yeah, we're werewolves, not swearwolves.
Exactly. So it's really great, and I would say start there.
Yeah.
And then, it has 96% on Rotten Tomatoes.
It's one of the funniest movies ever made.
It really is.
I know that recently Taika Waititi's humor has become a bit more, I think, saturated, but this is him at his best. It's classic like New Zealand humor in that it's very understated and quite silly.
Yes. So now we have the TV adaptation by the same name, What We Do in the Shadows, since 2019. It's 4 seasons in and going into its 5th season.
It's going strong.
And it's similar. It's a mockumentary. And it's documentary style, and it's 4 vampires who've lived together for hundreds of years, but they live on Staten Island. Their appointed leader is Nandor the Relentless, who's from the Ottoman Empire. Yeah. And then they have Laszlo, who's like a rogue and a dandy. That's how he would say. A rogue, a dandy, and a fop. Yeah. He's a lover of mischief.
Matt Berry plays him.
Matt Berry, and Nadja,
Yes.
who's the temptress and the Bonnie to Laszlo's Clyde, and that's played by Natasha Dimitro.
Yes, Natasha Demetrio. Or Demetrio.
Then we have what? Then we have the fourth vampire, Colin Robinson, who is an energy vampire,
Yes.
and he's played by Mark Prokish.
Proshk. I think.
Proshk.
Yeah.
Very.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah, Proshk.
But you recognize
You'll
him.
recognize him from The Office.
He was Dwight's like hapless assistant in the later seasons.
Yeah, he unrolled and rolled to create one-ply
One-ply toilet paper.
That's like one of them.
Yeah.
And then Harvey Guillen plays Guillermo, who
Yeah.
is the servant
familiar.
of Nandor, the
Yeah.
familiar of Nandor, and you come to find out some hidden secrets of Guillermo and his
You do.
ancestry, which is really amazing, and how it plays into what his role as a familiar is, but also his ancestral
Yes.
like need that he can't get past.
It's the perfect show because it expands the lore and the mythology of the movie. It does its own thing.
Yep.
But it in no way like tarnishes the movie. It's just as funny, if not funnier.
Yeah, I would argue funnier because it's of Colin Robinson. The introduction of Colin Robinson.
That is a game changer.
It's just it's out there.
Anyone who's ever worked in an office has met an energy vampire.
It's ridiculous, but in the best way. And it's still when you think it's just a comedy, it reminds you that it's also a horror.
Oh yeah.
And I believe it's on Hulu.
Yeah,
all 4 seasons.
It's an FX show. You can catch it on Hulu.
But I would start with the movie to get the
Definitely.
background because there are Easter eggs in the
Especially
show
in the-
that are relevant.
In the first
to,
season or two, there's a little bit of crossover,
Yeah.
and then the show, I think, once they realized that the show had its own legs, they really move on to do their own thing.
Yeah, and Kristen Schaal is now part of the cast.
She's
which
so good.
She's great. She's a dirty
Oh
vampire.
yeah, hilarious. The perfect part for her too.
What's your last?
Well, I'm just going to quickly recommend an incredible book. It's a classic. It's Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and the late great Terry
very
Pratchett.
Nice.
Good Omens was once described, I think, as if Monty Python wrote the Book of Revelation. It is an apocalyptic tale. It's a story of an unlikely friendship between a demon and an angel. It's about the end of the world, and this demon and this angel have both grown quite fond of the world and decide that they're going to band together to avert the apocalypse. Even though it's prophesied and it's the way heaven and hell want it to happen, they've decided they're going to save this messy, strange planet they've grown so fond of. It's a delightful, hilarious book by two masters of the genre and of writing.
Mm-hmm.
The Amazon series starring David Tennant and Michael Sheen is also wonderful. I believe it's got a second season coming. And they really play into something that's implied in the book, but it's not overtly stated, if I'm remembering correctly, is that there was a bit more to their friendship. That it was these are beings that have known each other for tens of thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a forbidden friendship, and they're in the show they do explore that a little bit. It's delightful watching two incredible actors playing a little bit against type. I mean, David Tennant plays the demon and Michael Sheen plays the angel. That's two people I think we're used to seeing in different kinds of roles. Anyway, Good Omens is a wonderful book. It's a quick read. It's super funny. But if you want to watch the show, do that too.
Awesome. So my last is a movie from 2019 or 2017. Sorry, because the second one comes out in 2019 because it does have a sequel, which is also very good. But I'm just going to talk about the first, which is Happy Death Day.
Oh, yes. Yeah, excellent.
So it is basically a Groundhog Day horror comedy. The main character, Tree, and it's played by Jessica Rothy, who expertly plays this.
Oh yeah.
Honestly, she's so good. Is one of the reasons I love this movie so much.
Every once in a while, there's just a perfect actor for a perfect part, and this is one of them.
So it's a Groundhog Day horror comedy. She's in college. She wakes up on her birthday in the bed of a student she thinks she hooked up with. And she feels like she's lived the day before.
She's having a shitty day.
She's having a real shitty day.
Yeah. It's
and
not
then
a day you would want to repeat.
A mass killer kills her in a terrible attack.
And just aside, the mask is awesome.
Oh, yeah.
It's like this weird baby mask.
And then she wakes up in Carter's dorm room again. So now she has to figure out who murdered her and how to stop getting murdered.
Yeah, so like if Groundhog Day was about solving your own murder instead of, orchestrating a fake personality to trick someone into falling in love with you.
It's produced by Jason Blum and Blumhouse, and it was directed by Christopher Landon.
Son of Michael Landon.
Yeah, and he's done
Freaky.
And Paranormal Activity.
Yep, he wrote a bunch of Paranormal Activity. He wrote and directed Freaky.
It is so good, like surprisingly amazing
and like satisfying.
Yeah, it really is. I feel like we've watched it a couple of times, and then Happy Death Day 2 it
takes a real sci-fi turn.
It
also
does.
and kind of like blows up the mythology of it.
It's so great. Just give it a watch. It doesn't take itself too seriously.
No, it's hilarious.
But it's a really well done film.
Really, really good. Yeah. And Christopher Landon's is a real talent. He's really nailed this the sweet spot of horror comedy, of making a funny movie that is also still a legit horror movie.
So we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time, everyone.
Scream, laugh, love, live, and die.
Well, don't die, because we need you to listen.
Come back and listen. So stay alive no matter what occurs.
Like and subscribe.
I will find you.
Terror in Tandem is written, produced, and recorded by Laura and Richard Mathiasen, and edited and mixed by Richard Mathiasen. Our theme was written and performed by Carrie Denver, and all other music was written and performed by David Suspanic. All opinions expressed on this podcast are our own and should be taken as such. Thanks for listening, and please remember to give us a like, a review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time. We're Stan.